Welcome to Strategies and Tools for Principals to Support the School Community Virtually, sponsored by the Maryland State Department of Education, Office of Leadership Development and School Improvement. I'm Kia Johnson, Project Coach with Insight Education Group.
And I'm Kim Day, also a project coach with Insight Education Group. We're glad you're here to join us today.
The Office of Leadership Development and School Improvement is a part of the Division of Career and College Readiness at the Maryland State Department of Education. The office works to implement a system of support to foster the growth and retention of effective leaders that is grounded in rigorous standards, valid and reliable evaluations, and research-based practices. The office equips local leaders with the skills and knowledge to support the implementation of effective and equitable practices to allow equal access to a high quality education that fosters the support and growth and success of every student. For our time together today, we ask that everyone participates actively, that you remain open to new ideas, and that you trust the process. The materials that you'll need for our session are the accompanying participant guides. And if you get your phone out and go to your camera setting, you can scan the QR code, which will give you access to the Maryland Resource Hub, which houses all of the materials for today's session.
Thank you, Kia. For our session objectives today, we're going to be exploring strategies and tools for supporting the school community virtually, as well as self-assessing and creating actionable next steps for maintaining self-care, communication, instructional support, and sustaining morale and social emotional support. We acknowledge that people come to the table with different levels of expertise and different experiences. We emphasize that this situation is unique and will be a challenging learning experience for all. During our time together, we'll examine self-care first. We'll move into communication, instructional support, sustaining morale and social emotional support, and then we'll end with a wrap-up and reflection. And during that time, we'll ask you to take some time to prioritize the action steps that you identified during our time together.
So before we begin, we wanted to ensure that we have a common language and understanding around distance learning. Take a moment to read the definition of distance learning to yourself. This is the working definition that we'll use as we talk through how to navigate and support our virtual school communities today. So as we work together today, there's a few things that we would like for you to keep at the forefront of your mind. And the first one is that equity considerations are essential and that it is going to be critical that as we support our school communities, that we think about how we can do so in an equitable manner.
Additionally, we're going to be making some intentional connections to Maryland's professional standards for educational leaders to emphasize the fact that what we're focusing on is connected to our professional responsibilities.
In addition to those, it is going to be crucial to remain flexible as you think about how to support your school community at this challenging time.
Last but not least, we want to recognize that this is not a one-size-fits-all process. We want everyone to honor where they are, be reflective, and again, we're going to leave with some specific actionable next steps. While we realize that this webinar is not going to provide enough time to be able to completely flesh out all of those next steps, opportunities will be offered to stop and jot and capture thinking. So we encourage you to follow along with us actively. So Kia, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to begin with self-care. And so as we begin to engage in the self-care conversation, we want to make an intentional connection to PSEL standard number 6, professional capacity of school personnel, which states effective educational leaders develop the professional capacity and practice of school personnel to promote each student's academic success and well-being.
And self-care is so important, Kim. And in a time when we tend to be focused on those that we support in our school communities, we have to remember that our own self-care is equally as important. We want to acknowledge the stress and demands to perform, and they are extensive at this time. As a leader, your team is looking to you for direction. It is crucial to be transparent with your team about how you are taking care of yourself so that you can effectively take care of the entire school community. Your example invites others to prioritize and take care of themselves as well so that they can be most effective for their students. For example, In a time when we are all easily accessible through technology, it is important to set boundaries and to communicate to your team that it's important that they do so as well.
I think as a connection to that, Kia, we also need to be consistent, thinking about how do we currently practice self-care, and we need to be honest with ourselves. So jot those ideas down as we think through this section together. Maybe you currently have a strong sense of how you practice self-care, or maybe this is the next step for you. Whatever the case may be, it will be critical to schedule time and stick to it.
And finally, consider tracking it. Some great ways to practice self care are physical exercise, reading, meditation, and hobbies. And one of the ways that you can track it is by using the tool that we have here. It's broken up into 4 quadrants: mind, heart, soul, and body. And this aligns directly with PCEL Standard 6, which states that the school leader collaboratively develops and uses data to inform a plan to foster professional growth of self. We ask that you consider for each of these quadrants how you're pouring into yourself and maintaining yourself. And finally, how will you hold yourself accountable to take care of yourself in these areas?
I would just note that you'll notice that there's a small little page in the bottom right-hand corner of some of our slides. That page number correlates with a specific page in your participant guide. So if you're looking for a place to jot some notes, in this case, you'll find this particular tracker on page 2.
So take a moment to think about 2 of your specific self care actions. What do they look like in our current reality? When will you do them? How often? And how will you hold yourself accountable? Please take about a minute and begin to really think about that plan for yourself and jot down some of your thoughts on page 3 in your participant guide. We're going to move on to our next portion, but we encourage you at the conclusion of this session to please return back to this template and really, really be intentional about creating a plan that you can hold yourself accountable to for taking care of yourself.
Thanks, Kia. So we're going to go ahead and move on into communication. And the connection to the standards that we want to make here is to PCEL standard number 9, operations and management, which states effective educational leaders manage school operations and resources to promote each student's academic success and well-being.
Research proves that shorter communication cycle times are more effective in building and sustaining morale and engagement.
With that being said, it's important to reset and clarify expectations. In this new virtual environment, leaders must help their teams shift to asynchronous work and personalization. Help the team to reset expectations for how work gets done. Leaders will have to let go of when and how tasks are accomplished. Allow team members to accomplish their responsibilities according to their schedule and needs. This does not mean that the leader always is the person responsible for the communication. Regular, consistent communication will ensure that all team members are on the same page, will ultimately decrease stress and fear of the unknown that can occur when communication is lacking.
Absolutely, Kim. And I think one way to ensure that that communication does stay consistent is to organize short and frequent touch points. Research indicates that we should not go more than a half day without checking in with our teams in some capacity. Think about how you normally meet: leadership team meetings, PLCs, etc. How can those continue and still fit into the parameters of the virtual school community? Remember, we discussed the need for frequent communication. The purpose is as much for communicating school-specific updates as it is for ensuring and maintaining the well-being of your entire team.
So whether it's a short check-in or a longer team meeting, the school leader can and should delegate the responsibilities for facilitating these touch points. Delegation supports that self-care effort we mentioned just a few minutes ago.
So take a moment to reflect on your current communication practices. What is working and what's been a challenge? And what opportunities exist for you to improve in this area?
So as we begin to take a look at a very specific example, we want to go ahead and make a connection to another PCEL standard number 9, specifically stating School leaders employ technology to improve operational efficiency, which includes but is not limited to data and communication systems that monitor and improve the school outcomes.
So you have an example of this communication plan in your participant guide on page 4. So take a moment to review the plan. As you're reviewing it, we hope that it stands out to you. Firstly, that there are a variety of communication touch points facilitated by a variety of individuals or teams. Additionally, those touch points vary in frequency, purpose, and audience. Having a fully developed plan that is communicated to the staff alleviates stress. This is just one example. You may have other team members that might be a part of your plan. For example, your PTO may take part in some forms of communication in your school community.
So, whether this is something that you've already done, it's definitely something you can do now if you haven't. This is a tool that could be pushed out by social media, phone, or email. Kia, would you share some very specific examples of how some of these things could look?
Yes, in your participant guide on page 5, there are examples of a newsletter, and you'll see there that the newsletter is targeted to families, and the principal obviously did not have any specific updates at this time, but was able to just be positive and to reassure the school community that they were working hard and going to continue to provide students with an excellent education. You'll also see a sample social media posting, which is much shorter in content, is targeted towards students specifically, uses vibrant colors, and is encouraging students to create a study space so that they can make the most of their time as distance learners.
Excellent. Thank you, Kia.
So take a moment to think about your current strategies for communication. What do they look like in our current reality? What are your specific next steps? When will it happen? How often? And with whom will you share the responsibility? And most importantly, what do you need in order to communicate with all of your key stakeholders well? On page 5 in your participant guide, there is a space for you to start this plan, and we'll give you about a minute to get something down. We hope that you've started to consider how you will communicate with your school community. It is so important. And at the end of our session, that you'll return back to the participant guide to finish your plan.
So, our next topic is instructional support. And as we reflected on this particular area, we wanted to call specific attention to two of the professional standards. PCEL Standard 3, Equity and Cultural Responsiveness, which states effective educational leaders strive for equity of educational opportunity and culturally responsive practices to promote each student's academic success and well being. And then PCEL Standard number 4, Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment. Effective educational leaders develop and support intellectually rigorous and coherent systems of curriculum, instruction, and assessment to promote each student's academic success and well-being.
Thank you, Kim. So take a moment to review this quote from PCEL Standard 4. Whether we are in a virtual learning space or a face-to-face space, as school leaders, we still have the responsibility to support instruction. This includes observing practice, providing feedback and coaching support, and then providing any resources that will enhance student learning and ensure that there are equitable opportunities for students to learn. As we begin to engage in a conversation focused on instructional support during virtual learning, it is important to remain focused on the learning and keeping our students first. We are not recreating the entire school day. However, we want to be cognizant of helping to ensure that we provide students with meaningful learning experience while maintaining their connection to the school community. In order to do this well, it is critical that teachers continue to receive feedback and support on instructional practice.
Leaders should plan and schedule purposeful visits to learn how virtual learning works with the goal of utilizing their observations to provide resources and support that will benefit both teachers and students. Such visits will provide the school leader with firsthand knowledge of not only instructional success, but also to help teachers reflect on the actionable next steps that will benefit their students.
And as you're doing this, it is important to consider the concept of virtual teacher coaching, which will be the ongoing process of observation and feedback that will ultimately maximize teacher effectiveness and student achievement outcomes. So here's one example of a simple data collection tool that could be utilized during virtual visits. It is important to remember that the purpose is for feedback and support at this point. As a leader, you may opt to choose one area to focus on during your visit to a virtual classroom, but please prioritize based on the needs of your school and your teachers. As you are conducting virtual visits, please remember to connect coaching conversations to the Danielson rubrics, specifically planning and preparation, classroom environment, and instruction.
It will be important to outline your expectations for virtual learning through your continuity of learning plans. This will evolve and look different depending on the purpose. It may begin by visiting during the beginning of a lesson, but that will not always be the case.
Absolutely. And one thing that may also look different as you observe classrooms in the virtual setting is the length of the observation. Instruction from teachers to students in this setting is shorter to account for the changes in the environment. Therefore, your observation should be from about 10 to 15 minutes in length.
Excellent. So Kia, could we go ahead and if everybody could join us by looking in their participant guides at page 6, you will find a copy of this virtual visit data collection tool. Kia, can we talk through each of the components specifically and what we might
Absolutely.
think about?
Yes, absolutely, Kim. So you'll see the first look for there is high leverages practices utilized. And some of the things that you'll be looking for as you think about high leverage practices are the number of students that are actively participating, equitable opportunities for learning, culturally responsive practices, differentiated strategies for diverse learners, and specific virtual engagement strategies.
So one of the things that I noticed there, Kia, is that we have both a student column and a teacher column. What might be some of the things we might focus in on in capturing?
Absolutely. So we will, when you're looking at the teacher column, you're going to want to do just that, focus on the teacher, right? So what are the teacher moves that are happening? So if the teacher is doing a think, pair, share, or if the teacher is asking all of the kids to respond with a thumbs up or a thumbs down, those are going to be some of the specific teacher actions that you would want to make note of as you were observing. And then on the other side of that, you'll want to make sure you're taking note of how it is actually getting the students to be involved in the lesson. So how many students responded to a question? If you're looking at a Google document and you're seeing student responses, what was the quality of those responses? How many students actually submitted a response? If there are any students that are having trouble accessing the material, that's something that you would note there at that time.
Outstanding, thank you. So the next look for is learning in a virtual environment, and some of the specific descriptors that you may want to think about and focus in on as you visit these classrooms might be the following. How is the technology enhancing student learning? What's getting in the way of students' academic success as it relates to the technology? What's getting in the way of students' ability to access content? And or what's getting in the way of students' ability to engage with their peers and the teacher? Lastly, but definitely not least, what inequities may have surfaced due to the virtual environment? Kia, can we talk through maybe what that may look like, something we might focus in on there?
Yeah, so it's really important, I think, as you think about learning in the virtual environment to understand that unfortunately there's going to be some barriers that exist. And as you're thinking about learning in the virtual environment, you're going to want to watch critically for those things. So, for example, inadequate access to internet. If a student is not able to remain logged in the full time and they miss parts of the lesson, um, or if a student is not as technologically savvy and is not able to navigate just the actual technical functions on the computer, that could be a barrier for them being able to benefit fully from the lesson. So those are things we would want to note as we're observing the learning in the virtual environment.
Thank you.
Next, you would want to think about opportunities for support. So, as you're looking at teacher actions and student actions and reviewing high leverage practices and all of the things that are contributing to the learning virtual environment, you'll want to ask yourself what additional supports can be provided to enhance the delivery of instruction or student learning in this new setting.
I think it's important to note that this, as you said earlier, this is the new landscape for everyone. So sort of having that lens about what can we do as leaders or coaches to help facilitate that is going to be important.
Yeah, and I think that also ties directly back to that initial piece we talked about with flexibility is that we're going to have to come with fresh eyes and a fresh lens so that we can really be open to what the needs of our teachers and students are in this new context.
Absolutely. And something else you said earlier, that regardless of being virtual or face to face, we still have a professional obligation to support teachers. And I think sometimes we want to say, well, let's just let them be because this is new, but this, if they ever needed support, this is the time when they need it.
Absolutely, Kim.
So I think that connects to this next piece. So you were talking about opportunities for support, and the next look for is actionable feedback. So in thinking about and reflecting on the evidence collected during a virtual visit, we want to ask ourselves what teacher practice that was observed most positively impacted student learning, and we really want to talk that through with the teacher and really highlight why that was important for students. And secondly, what actionable next step in teacher practice would enhance student outcomes?
And I think as you are talking through this, you mentioned the with the teacher part, and I think that is so critical. It will be challenging for schedules to coordinate in this time, but the emphasis that's placed on that post observation conversation and really sharing, feedback with that teacher and what those specific next steps are, and engaging in dialogue around how they can take their practice from good to great is going to be so critical in making sure that our students are getting what they deserve during this time.
Excellent.
So with that said, we're going to need resources. So once those actionable next steps are identified, then you'll have to consider what does my teacher need in order to enact these next steps. So what additional resources, what trainings and supports might they need to help ensure that students are getting an equitable and rigorous instruction consistently.
Absolutely. And that being said, since we're going to be visiting these virtual classrooms, it's going to be important to think about as we go from virtual classroom to virtual classroom, what are the trends we're noting? Because there are going to be some things that start to stand out. So we need to think about, are there any of those trends that we note? Are they consistent? And if so, what are they? And then how can we address those things together?
Absolutely. And I think as a final piece, it is really important that these virtual classroom visits are used and are seen as a way to benefit teaching and learning in our school communities. So there should be, again, very specific and clear next steps for teachers. But as a school leader, you should also walk away with a clear vision of what where your school is currently and what gaps exist between where you want to be and what you need to do in order to make sure that teaching and learning is happening at the levels at which you desire in your school.
Excellent. So let's go ahead and let's talk about how we might prepare for that virtual visit.
So as you prepare for a virtual visit, we are actually going to set up a scenario for you all in just a moment. So our next few slides will actually walk us through what it would look like to set up a visit. But some of the things you'll want to consider are first defining your purpose and making sure that you and both the teachers that you're observing are clear on what the current needs are. um, have that pre-conference with the teacher so that you go into the observation knowing all of the information that you need to know in order to assess what's happening in that virtual classroom well. Facilitate the post-visit coaching conversation as I referenced previously. So you are talking thoroughly with that teacher about what teacher practice supported student learning and what potential next steps would the teacher would need. And then again, following up. So having the post-conference conversation is key, but also following back up with that teacher to make sure that they have the resources and materials that they need to provide that excellent instruction to students. So for our virtual visit scenario, I'm going to be Miss Apple, who is a seventh grade ELA teacher. And the priorities at my school right now are building, supporting the early implementation of virtual learning, improving teacher practice, and supporting student learning.
All right. All right, Miss Apple. So we're going to take some time to have a conversation prior to my visit to your virtual classroom. Thank you for allowing us to have that time together. I know you're super busy supporting students. So my first question is really a prompt. Can you just tell me a little bit about the class that I'm going to be visiting? What do I need to know going in?
Sure. It's my seventh grade ELA class, and we were working on a novel unit prior to the school closure. So we are actually continuing to work on that novel unit. And the skills that we'll be focusing on when you observe are making inferences and being able to pull um, text from the evidence to support that inference. It's a very diverse class. I have 3 students that are English language learners in that class, and I also have 2 students that have individualized education plans in that class, and it's a class of 25 students.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. So for that particular lesson, what's the expectation for student success or mastery by the time they finish?
So they will be given a specific excerpt from the novel that we're reading together, and the expectation is that they are able to make an inference and be able to pull specific evidence from the text and events from the text to justify the inference that they've made.
Thank you. So obviously we're utilizing a virtual platform, but in addition to that, what specific technologies are you planning to utilize to support instruction and student learning?
So in the virtual classroom, there are a few functions that I'm going to utilize to try to keep students engaged. One is the chat function, so students will be able to submit their responses to my prompts and some responses to each other through the chat box. I'm also using the reaction function, so there's a happy face and a sad face, and there's a thumbs up and a thumbs down. So at certain points in the lesson, I'm going to stop and check for understanding or poll them and allow them to participate and engage in that way. And I'll also be following up with the use of my ultimate assessment will be a Google document where I'll be able to read the inferences and their justification and review the evidence that they choose from the excerpt.
All right, thank you. So lastly, are there any challenges that you anticipate for kids or students, either instructionally or technologically?
Yes, there are. So it has been different getting used to teaching in this environment. And one of the things that I do worry about, particularly as a literacy teacher, is some of my students don't have the supports that they've always had in the classroom. So my English language learners and my students that have IEPs have additional support and people pushing in to support them during the lesson. And that has not yet been coordinated for the virtual classroom. So I do worry that they may struggle to access the material. I also just worry about generally students staying on task in the classroom. I can use proximity and I can see what students are producing to make sure that they stay on task. And that's much harder to do when we're on computers and if they're not on video or if their audio is off. So just making sure that I have as many kids on and that as many of them are as engaged as possible is something that I worry about.
Absolutely. So last but not least, I just always like to ask this question. Is there anything specific you want me to focus on or look for?
I think that would be the thing I would like for you to be looking for, student engagement and on task. And I think when we follow back up, I would love to actually look at the student products and see what they've done so we can see if we're getting a return on in terms of just the quality of the in their assessment, what they're doing. Because I do worry that they just won't be as engaged or that they may need a little bit more support. And I can't give that to them through the computer screen. So if you could watch for that and we can talk about that in our post conversation, I'd really appreciate that.
Absolutely happy to do it. Thank you. Looking forward to this.
Thank you. So unfortunately, you all will not be able to see my amazing lesson, but I assure you it was amazing. But we are going to take a moment now to review the evidence that was collected during the observation. And then we'll take some time to talk through some components of the virtual visit data collection tool together.
So if you'll refer to page 7 of your participant guide, you will find the document that you see on the screen in front of you that includes the evidence. So take a minute, as Kia suggested, and take a look through the evidence. We'll come back together.
As you're reviewing it, notice that we've been intentional about recording the number of students that were present, the number of students that were participating at different points, and some of the prompts that the teacher used to invite students to participate in the lesson. Feel free to annotate or make notes as you're reading through the evidence.
All right, so if we can go ahead and come back together. Kia, I would love if you and I could kind of talk through some of the look fors in the evidence, and then we'll get involved in the conversations for opportunities for support and those things that follow. Would that be okay?
That's great.
Excellent. So as I visited the classroom, and we're going to take you out of it now from being the teacher to being the coach. So let's reflect on this evidence together. So I want to look at the student piece. I noticed, or during the visit, we tried to be intentional, as you suggested, in focusing in on how many students were actively engaged. And the evidence indicates that the teacher was using the chat windows. 14 of the kids of the 18 that were present in this lesson were actually active in the chat window. 2 of the students responded by adding their references to the chat box. They weren't vocal about it, but they did type in. I know that during the think aloud, that was super important for students, and you encouraged them to capture their thoughts in the note catcher that you provided, which was a Google Doc that you could actually see them, in some instances, adding their notations. That also gave you an indication or the teacher an indication as to what students were doing in that engagement piece.
Yes.
That thumbs up strategy was important because you were able to see some of the students interact. What were your thoughts?
I think it's definitely, I think, impressive when you think about the length of time for this observation that there were as many opportunities for students to engage. So I think the teacher, did a great job setting that up. I also noted the use of highly relative and interest items for the teacher. As she set the hookup, they were looking at a popular music figure, and I think that was a good way to get students excited about what they were going to be working on for that day. And she was very intentional about making sure the expectations were clear and continuing to provide entry points to the lesson for students who may not have participated yet. So as opposed to just resigning to the fact that, all right, I had most of the students submitting a response, she did use a prompt to say, I have 4 teammates that have not submitted a response. Let me know if you need help using the chat function, which I also think is a really great way to redirect students, because it assumes that they may be having a challenge as opposed to that they're just actively not participating.
Well, I just want to reiterate the teacher's expectation for the 100% participation. Clearly push some students to re-engage if they weren't already, where you could really notice that. In terms of the learning in a virtual environment, I think one of the things based on the evidence collected that was important for students was that think aloud. It's always important for that model to be present in a classroom, but even more so when you're not right there, as you said earlier, to be able to read body language, facial expressions, et cetera, and engage any kind of possible student frustration. That was very important for your students.
Yes, and I think the annotation as well, the fact that the teacher provided a visual representation of the annotations was also very helpful, because for students that may have had trouble with the audio aspect of it, just listening to the think aloud, they were able to engage and see her thinking visually represented through those annotations. So I think both were done well and provided many ways for different types of learners to engage with the content.
Absolutely. So based on the evidence collected, let's talk through these other components as we mentioned on the previous slides when we looked at the tool. So let's think about, as we look at this evidence and reflect, what might have been what might be some opportunities for support for this teacher.
Yeah, so I think the first thing we would need to make sure that we do is think about access to technology. There were 18 students present on the call or virtual classroom session
Mhm.
out of 25, and there were also 4 students who seemed to not be as engaged or able to participate or submit responses. So when you get down to that number, you're looking at about 14 out of 25 kids who are actually benefiting from a lesson, and that's not a good enough number because we're striving for 100%. So I think checking their access to strong internet, to a device, figure out whatever barriers exist, and then try to work to mitigate those so that students can access the virtual classroom environment and be engaged in it.
And I think to kind of jump down to one of the boxes toward the bottom of the tool, where it talks about trends, that's something that being the person visiting classrooms, maybe I noted that in multiple classrooms, that's a trend that we have students who are having access issues, and we need to pay attention and start to figure that out together as a
Absolutely.
team.
Because if we're working at this ratio across an entire school building, you're looking at far too many kids that are not getting access to their education. And that's just not acceptable. And also, our teachers are working extremely hard to provide students with meaningful learning experiences right now. So we want their work to reach all of their kids.
Speaking of that, I think that connects directly to that idea of actionable feedback, right? So, in this particular visit, some of the things that really stood out as impactful for students in the evidence were the model that was provided by the teacher, right? The opportunities to check for understanding, the expectation of 100% engagement for students. Those things all contributed to the students that were participating, being able to participate and begin to be successful. Using the chat and offering the assistance and saying, "Hey, if you're having trouble, let me know." Like you said, you're the positive presupposition that it's not just that they're ignoring you; it's that they're having trouble in some way being able to do that.
Absolutely. And I think one way to take that from good to great is to just spiral in some more checks for understanding. I think the strategies employed were great. However, she mentioned also being a little bit worried about students becoming disengaged or off task at any point, which is very easy to do, right? They're on devices. They could easily open another tab and go to a website or turn their camera off or whatever the case may be. And so I think that if during that read aloud and think aloud, if there were shorter times and chunked in smaller pieces and stopped to get students' input and to probe students on what they were thinking or what she was doing, that would just make students stay on their toes a bit more and know that they don't have as much time to get distracted while she's doing that modeling.
So that leads us into sort of the idea about what resources might we provide to this teacher, what might be successful. And in thinking about that, did you have any ideas?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of a resource, it would be really great to. I think one thing to do with to know just across literacy in the school building, how what literacy strategies are people using because literacy is really hard to teach virtually, um, and providing professional development and training around those pieces. So one that I think would align really well with this specific teacher's needs is that check for understanding and the scaffolding. So for those students who she was worried about accessing the text and who may be diverse learners for whatever reason, how are you scaffolding virtual literacy instruction so that it is accessible for everyone? And so those are two pieces of training, and I think getting additional resources that could really benefit this teacher and probably the entire school community because literacy is taught in every content.
Absolutely. And so that leaves us with last but definitely not least, because we can do all this, but if we don't follow through with the next steps, right, where does that leave us? So really thinking about following up on having those post-conference, post-visit conversations, as you've indicated a couple of times, being able to actually follow up on providing those resources that we discussed. But also something else, as you and I looked at the evidence that we talked about, is that it might be important not just talking with the teachers in general, but also talking with students to find out from their perspective what are the things that are working, but also what are the things that are from their perspective are making it difficult to access the learning in the virtual environment. Anything you want to add to that?
No, I think hearing directly from students is very important, especially as students get older. I think they should be able to advocate for themselves, and we should be able to meet them where they are so that we can supply whatever they need to do this well.
Excellent. Thank you.
So think about your current strategies for providing instructional support. What does it look like in your current reality? What are your specific next steps? How are you going to communicate the purpose and the process to your team? And what are you doing to monitor professional responsibilities? Most importantly, again, last but certainly not least, what do you need to ensure that you are maintaining rigorous and relevant instruction in your school community? Take a minute on page 8 in your participant guide to start beginning to think through that plan. So we're going to move on to our final topic for today, but this is a critical piece as you think about supporting the virtual school community, and we definitely encourage you to come back to this and fully think through and finish your instructional plan.
Thank you, Kia. All right, so as we move into our last topic, sustaining morale and social and emotional support, I want to connect us back to PSAL standard number 5, which says community of care and supports for students, specifically stating effective educational leaders develop the professional capacity and practice of school personnel to promote each student's academic success and well-being.
So focusing on sustaining morale and social emotional support is a critical component in every aspect of managing the virtual school community. Humans are hyper-social creatures that long to belong, and connection will assist in maintaining the well-being of both students and staff. The way that it looks for individuals is unique, and we need to be prepared to meet people where they are. School leaders will need to be intentional in finding ways to bring staff together, whether it's whole group, small group, or one-on-one, to ensure that that need for human connection is being met.
This is important to note that this is not a solo responsibility, as we've said, keeping in mind that self-care idea. We need to make sure that we're leveraging the strengths of the team by taking turns and assigning tasks based on individual strengths. As teams begin to think about how you will support the social emotional needs of your staff, one important factor will be authenticity. The intent here is not to cause undue stress. Therefore, delegation and remaining true to leadership style is critical.
Absolutely. And the facilitation of virtual team building opportunities is a unique and fun way to maintain connection among the key stakeholders in your school community. So we're going to take a look at a few examples. So to the left here, we have an example of a virtual spirit week with suggestions for daily fun themes. On the top right is a screenshot of a team actively participating in a spirit week and showing pictures of their favorite characters or their favorite books at a virtual staff meeting. And below that, you have a teacher who really went all out and is wearing her Wonder Woman pajamas during a virtual lesson. So these teams have found fun and creative ways to integrate joy into their school community and into their work. But the thing I also would like to highlight here is that these are things that are low lift. In each of these specific scenarios, the teams of teachers came together to come up with the ideas and the themes, sent it out to the entire school community, and everyone joined in to participate. So this is something that is designed to be fun, but not designed to monopolize any of your time because that's already limited. So take a moment to think about your current strategies for sustaining morale and social emotional support. What does that look like in this current context? What are your specific next steps? When will it happen? How often will it happen? And with whom are you going to share the responsibilities? And again, what do you need? On page 9 in your participant guide, there's a template for you to begin planning this out. So we're going to come back together and begin to close out our session. But again, please return back to your participant guide to finish this plan because we do not want to neglect joy. We need joy in our work right now. So, of the plans we've worked through today, we need to take a moment and prioritize. We've discussed self care, communication, instructional support, and maintaining social emotional support and the balance and well beings of our teams. Prioritize your action items based on urgency and immediate need. Where are things going really well, and what feels the most urgent and immediate for you? On page 10 in your participant guide, there's a template there that allows you to identify your urgent and immediate items and also the resources that you'll need to begin to get to work on them.
As you're working through this plan, make sure that you're really thinking through those actionable, specific next steps so that when you leave us today and you have a few minutes to sit down and reflect, you'll be able to start to put some of those things into action. So we know this is a short webinar and our time together is just about over. So as we begin to pull ourselves back together, we wanted just to direct you to this resource page. When you have a chance, please take some time to go back and access some of these resources. You can find all of the session materials available on the Maryland Resource Hub, which is linked here.
And finally, we just want to thank you for your participation today. It is such an admirable thing that as school leaders, you all are working so hard to further your learning and to better yourself so that you can better opportunities for your students and for your teachers. So we thank you so much and we're wishing you the best of luck.
We appreciate your feedback. So if you'll take some time and click the link in the orange box and provide that, thank you. Last but not least, if you have any questions, please feel free to direct those questions to the Maryland Department of Education, specifically the Office of Leadership Development and School Improvement, Mr. Ed Mitzel and Ms. Lori Ellis. Their contact information is on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you.